Hello again, Batfans, and welcome back to the comic book history of Batman. In the last episode of the main series, Batman and Robin worked together against Maxi Zeus and King Snake. The dynamic duo had become the perfect match for the criminals of Gotham. However, the creators of the Batman comics in the early 90s didn't want to overuse Robin, and that's why in the stories of this episode, Batman works alone. Starting with Batman 471, the Dark Knight goes out with Ace the Bat-Hound on a training mission. The two of them come across Killer Croc, who recently escaped from Arkham Asylum and started living in a fallout shelter underneath Gotham, with a group of homeless people. Croc was their protector, and he stole food and items for them. Batman looks into the mystery and follows the trail of Croc with help from Ace. They eventually find the shelter and the battle begins. Killer Croc viciously attacks Batman and almost defeats him. He only gets distracted when Ace bites him. The dog gives Batman enough time to explain to Croc that the new water tunnels of the city are about to be opened and the shelter would be destroyed. Croc and Batman try to hold the walls of the shelter as the water starts flooding the place. Croc tells Batman to leave him and take the homeless to safety. Batman and Ace take the people out of the shelter, but Croc can't escape and the water takes him away. Everyone thinks Croc is dead, and his new family starts singing in his memory. This one is an interesting story. It marks Killer Croc's comeback 5 years after the crisis, and the interesting part is that Killer Croc was somehow reformed. He was almost a good guy, protecting the homeless. I really like this story. Maybe it's because I'm a sucker for stories that end with a song. They always get to me. I actually felt sad for Croc, even though I knew he wasn't dead. But even if he was, if this was the last appearance of Croc, it would have been perfect. All I know is that this is a good story. After all, it was written by Alan Grant with art by Norm Breyfogle. Sadly, not every story is a winner. The next one, for example, is one of the worst Batman stories I've ever read. In Detective Comics 638, Batman has to find a metahuman who has escaped from isolation and would cause a massive explosion, killing hundreds of people. What makes the story so bad is that the military and the police are involved in a confusing plot that makes everyone look bad. The characterization of Batman is terrible. He acts almost like a fool, or at least a terrible amateur. It's one of those cases where the characters are just there to make the story work. The irony is that, in the end, it just doesn't work at all. It's so awful all the way through, from the intentionally confusing beginning to the anticlimactic ending. Not even the great art by Jim Aparo could save this train wreck. The writer of this story was Peter Milligan, and after doing this one, he got one final ambitious project for Batman. Milligan is best known for writing Dark Knight, Dark City, and a bunch of other supernatural stories in the Batman comics, but after almost a year of doing Batman, it was time for him to take his final bow. And so he came up with his final story for the Batman comics, a 4-part mystery called The Idiot. And as if that name wasn't weird enough, the whole story is not easy to follow. So buckle your seatbelts because Batman has a new enemy. Her name is the Queen of Hearts. She is called that because she is a serial killer who collects the hearts of her victims, and she dresses up as a queen. She's a rare novelty because no other villain can be so campy, and yet so gruesome. In the story, the Queen of Hearts is supposed to be an old enemy of Batman who has escaped Arkham and traveled all the way to Brazil. Batman follows her, but while he is on the South American country, he comes across another enemy, someone that calls himself the Idiot. So now Batman faces a double threat, the Queen of Hearts and the Idiot. The problem is that the Idiot is not human. He was created when 4 mental patients consumed a special drug that sent their collective minds into the Idiot Zone. Their minds were joined together and they formed the Idiot. He is a 5th personality that wants to cross into the real world, and in order to do so, he infects people with the Idiot drug, turning them into mindless zombies as he steals their minds. One of his victims is the Queen of Hearts, and that's how we get rid of her. Batman then travels into the Idiot Zone, but he is overpowered by the Idiot and his surrealistic powers. Eventually, the Idiot finds a way into the real world, where he continues to steal people's minds. But of course, in the real world, Batman has the advantage, and he finds a way to stop the Idiot and make him disappear. Broadly speaking, this is a very complex and convoluted storyline. It has a very fast-paced introduction, as they needed to establish all the information in the first issue, but that's negative for the story, as it's too much crammed into one single issue, which makes it unbelievable. The story is also confusing at first, which in turn makes it boring. It only becomes interesting after the first 2 issues, when they get rid of the Queen of Hearts, and that's a problem on itself, because let's face it, she was there just to get Batman to Brazil. I wish they didn't do that, because it created a weak start and because a potentially interesting new enemy was utterly wasted. In the second half of the storyline, Batman finally becomes the Dark Knight detective and works to stop the threat of the Idiot. Unfortunately, the climax of the story is a complete letdown. Such a big threat gets resolved in a couple of pages, and the solution almost comes out of nowhere. The whole thing was poorly executed. This is one of those storylines that would work perfectly in modern days, when stories take about 6 to 7 issues to resolve, but because back then a story lasted about 4 issues, it fails to reach the maximum potential, and we end up with idiotic plots. This 4-part story was published as a crossover between Batman and Detective Comics, so naturally the art was done by Norm Brayfogle in Batman and by Jim Aparo in Detective. Needless to say, the art is the best part of the whole deal. This was the last Batman effort of writer Peter Milligan, who was fascinated with the supernatural and the strange. It certainly was an ambitious project, but in the end I think it backfired. And last on this episode we're checking out another crossover, but this time it's a very good story, and actually very important to the Batman continuity as a whole. It is called The Destroyer, a 3-part story that takes place in Batman, Legends of the Dark Knight, and Detective Comics. The story begins in Batman 474, where a mysterious man decides to destroy random buildings around Gotham. He blows up 2 buildings on the same night, and Batman starts investigating. After following the most obvious clues, he deduces that whoever is behind the crimes is doing it just for the art. Indeed, the Destroyer is blowing up the buildings that are blocking the view of the old architecture of Gotham. His goal is to remove the new buildings and allow the people to see the greatness of the old Gotham City. Without a doubt, this is a magnificent first issue. Not only is the art by Norm Brayfogle astounding, the writing by Alan Grant is phenomenal. We get to discover the truth along with Batman, instead of just listening to his great deductive mind. We see what Batman sees and how he reacts, which is much more powerful than just using words. The story continues in Legends of the Dark Knight number 27, where Batman investigates the origins of the old buildings of Gotham. His great-great-grandfather, Solomon Wayne, hired Cyrus Pinckney, an architect with strange ideas. They built most of the old Gotham City, with designs that were considered to be dark and horrendous. The Destroyer, however, is fascinated with the old Gotham buildings, and that's why he is destroying all the modern buildings, including the Wayne Foundation building. This second chapter was written by Dennis O'Neil and illustrated by Chris Sprouse. The sequential art is the best part of the issue, because it's very modern and dynamic. The final chapter happens in Detective Comics 641, where the Destroyer blows up the GCPD headquarters. Eventually, Batman lures the Destroyer to a trap, and after a fierce final combat, the enemy is defeated. However, with much of the modern architecture blown to pieces, the landscape of Gotham City has returned to the old, haunting image full of dark and massive buildings. The Destroyer is an excellent story, and it's very important in regards to the way the Batman comics were published. You see, this is the first time a Batman story was published as a crossover between 3 different titles, and because it was so well received and so successful, DC started doing crossovers for all the big Batman storylines of the 90s. This story started a trend that lasted for a whole decade. Not many people liked that concept back then, because it meant getting more comics just to get one story. However, this concept allowed us to get phenomenal stories like Nightfall, Contagion, Cataclysm, and No Man's Land. Sure, you had to pay more, but you also got more interesting dynamics, because one big storyline could be written and illustrated by more than just one creative team, which is something I really dislike of modern comics, where the same creative teams gets about 3 to 5 years in the Batman comics. That's 5 years of the same writing and the same art. It really gets boring, stale, and repetitive, but that never happened with the Batman stories from the 90s. These kinds of publications required a great editorial coordination and good communication between the creative teams. Thanks to those efforts, they could publish 3-part crossovers in less than 1 month. That's really the crowning achievement of the 90s Batman comics. And it all started with The Destroyer. Not only a great publication effort, but very important in terms of Batman continuity. Thanks to this story, Gotham became much more than just the name for a city. With this story, Gotham became another important character in the Batman mythos. And it's all thanks to Anton Furst. All of the designs for the old Gotham buildings were illustrated by Anton Furst, who was the art designer for the 1989 Batman movie. And because Tim Burton was already working on a sequel, the Batman editor Dennis O'Neil decided to bring that vision of Gotham into the comics, and he got Anton Furst to design the new architecture for Gotham. This new old architecture for Gotham was extremely important for the next decade in the Batman comics, as all the writers and artists now had a blueprint of how Gotham should look like and what kind of stories could take place in that city. This was a wonderful development, thanks to the important contributions by Anton Furst, who sadly passed away not long after working in this storyline. This is one of his final professional works, and the legacy he left behind is still present in all of the Batman comics, especially in the 90s. And speaking of that, we still have many more comics to go through, and in the next video we will check out the first confrontation between Joker and the new Robin. If you don't want to miss that, subscribe now and come back for the next episode. Until then, Godspeed, my friends.